Kona is just in the process of restarting the computer to try and log in, but I think we should probably get started.
Okay, I'll get started here. Well, good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending where you're calling in from. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's seminar. Yeah, this seminar is being presented with English and French interpretation. And to choose either language, please use the button on the lower left of your screen. And I just want to introduce myself now. My name is Harley Crowshoe. My Blackfoot name is Gayupika, which means bear child. And I'm Blackfoot from the Pigundia Nation, which is located in southern Alberta. And I'm calling in from the traditional lands of the Blackfoot people on Treaty 7. And a little bit about me is I'm retired, but my background is policing, justice, and health. Quite a combination. And today I'm just so honored to be here, and certainly honored to be part of the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, Unmarked Burials. And today is going to be filled with a lot of conversation on forensics, and also looking at the many shared knowledge and experience from our experts. So in just a moment, I will introduce today's panelists, but first I am honored to invite Monica Isusaut to provide an opening prayer. And Monica is a Inuk elder and a residential school survivor. She attended residential school in Chesterfield Inlet and in Manitoba. Monica holds a master's degree in education and has an extensive background in promoting Inuit language and culture. Among many accomplishments, she has served as board member of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and on two Law Commissions of Canada panels addressing residential school abuse and institutional abuse. She is a member of the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials. So I'm just so honored that you're here with us, and you're going to lead us through the welcoming and the prayer. So I'll turn it over to you, Monica, and I see your mic is on, so that's great.
Kaya nami. Tuksak tiltama. Kayak tayo mayunga. Tukatyak tami. Tuksakon nakalpunga. First, I'd like to say the religious meaning of truth, of reconciliation is the Roman Catholic sacrament of penance, which is an act of self-abasement or repentance for sin. The truth is that the Pope failed to address the doctrine of discovery in his apology to the Canadian Indigenous population. We have been dehumanized, and our basic human rights have been taken away. The Constitution and the government policies are based on the doctrine that try to blot us out and to render us worthless. So I will pray about this. So I pray against the spiritual forces that wage against our people groups. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime. I pray for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who are the victims of injustice, and I pray that God's justice will prevail over the various evils that victimized us. I pray that the murderous ways be obliterated in the fire of divine judgment. I pray not only for our people who are enslaved in alcoholism, poverty, oppression, but also against the spiritual forces that undergirds such an oppressive society. I pray that the Lord defeat those powers of domination, of manipulation, and control, and also my reactions of anger, rage, revenge, hatred. judgment, and all the negative emotions. I surrender my vengeful desires and ask you to avenge me, O Lord. Please forgive me and heal me. Heal our land, Lord. After Cain murdered his brother, God said to him, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And now our little ones' blood are crying out from the ground. The earth is a spirit and is a spirited and vulnerable living being who experiences the terrible loss of the children's deaths. Give us wisdom and knowledge to deal with finding the unmarked graves and burials and to work with all the stakeholders. Paul said in the Bible that all creation is eagerly awaiting that future glorious day when God's children become who they were always meant to be. I give love to our land, the sea, the rivers, the lakes, the mountains, the trees, the ice, the sun, the moon, the stars, the clouds, the wind, rain, and the snow. And I bless them all. I tell them to flourish with abundance of life, crops, fish, land, and sea animals. I release your animals and all of nature to become who you were meant to be, free and roaming, flowing, flying, growing. I bless you and go forth in our land. Amen. Vietnamese. Vietnamese. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you for the beautiful words and those and the powerful words that come with that. And thank you for opening and starting our session in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
So before continuing, we would like to have a moment of silence to give us a chance to reflect on our own ways, on the reason why we're here today. Our common goal of honoring our children and those little spirits who never had the chance to return home. So with that, we'll take a few moments of silence to recognize them. Thank you. So I know we're probably having some technical difficulties, but hopefully we'll work through those and I guess have patience as we move forward. And today's webinar is sponsored by the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials. The National Advisory Committee was formed last year to assist First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and families gain access to reliable, trustworthy information about all aspects of the search for missing children. We do this by freely sharing the knowledge of our individual members and by promoting information sharing among communities that already have developed great expertise and experience through the work that they're already doing. Since you found this webinar, you've probably already seen the advisory committee website, but just in case you haven't, the address is nac-cnn.ca, and we'll certainly have that on our chat line at various times throughout the presentation. We have pulled together an extensive list of resources such as videos, FAQs, and background papers around many of the key elements of the search process. We have also published a short introductory overview to navigating community options. This is all available on the website. So today's webinar is about how to field forensic science and how the various disciplines can contribute to the search for residential school missing children. This is a very hard topic to talk about, and I want to remind everyone that the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is also available if you need someone to talk to. We'll put their toll-free number on the chat, and we'll have it on the screen a number of times throughout today's session. We also arranged for a health support worker, and her name is Sandra Delaron, to be online in a separate meeting room if you would prefer to be part of a group video conference. We'll also share that link on the chat line throughout. Finally, I want to let you know that today's webinar is also being live streamed in English and French on YouTube. If you have any difficulties with the video platform we're using for this session, your YouTube stream is there as an alternative. We also put that link in the chat. And I had better put my chat on so I can be sure that it's there. Yes, it is. Today, we are very fortunate to have a panel of 3 experts who introduce us to the field of forensics. And before we start, I'd like to share a few words of intro and a little bit of their background and their expertise and knowledge. So firstly, I'd like to introduce and share a little background of Dr. Rebecca Jacques. And she is a Métis. She currently works as a forensic pathologist at the London Health Sciences Centre in Ontario, and as an investigating coroner with the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario. She is also an assistant professor at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at the Western University, where she teaches on subjects such as trauma, post-mortem examinations, and the role of pathologists as expert witnesses. She's a member of the National Advisory Committee. Secondly, Dr. Kona Williams is a Cree and Mohawk. Like Rebecca, Kona is a forensic pathologist and coroner. Kona is also the First Nations liaison for the Ontario Forensics Pathology Service. She is currently the director of the Northeastern Regional Forensic Pathology Unit in Sudbury, Ontario, and co-chairs of the Indigenous Health Committee, Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. Kona is also a member of the National Advisory Committee. And also Dr. Kathy Groupier is a forensic anthropologist with the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service. She has degrees in archaeology, physical anthropology, and law. She regularly testifies in criminal proceedings and testified for the Grout inquiry into pediatric forensic pathology, for which she also wrote a research paper. She has undertaken extensive field work and analyze of human remains around the world, including Kosovo, East Timor, and Cambodia. Her teachings contributions include law courses for forensic science students and forensic science courses for law students, as well as courses in for forensic anthropology. So it is an honor, and I'm very grateful that we have this opportunity to hear from these 3 individuals that have so much experience, knowledge, and expertise, and just thank them for the commitment that they're undertaken to guide us as we move forward. So I'd like to welcome Rebecca and turn this over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Harvey. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you, Monica, for the opening prayer, such powerful words, and really setting us in a good way. Harvey, thank you for the lovely introduction. Yes, my name is Rebecca Jocks. I'm a citizen of Métis Nation, and I come from the North Shore of Lake Huron. But today I'm calling in from the traditional lands of Chinooktun, Lenawapak, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabeg. And this morning I was reminded that this is also the lands of our two-legged relatives, as geese were speaking the language of their people and notifying us that they're nesting and to be careful around their area. So I'm forensic pathologist in Corner, and I work here in Ontario. And the focus of my talk will be giving a broad overview of the role of forensic disciplines in the search for residential schools missing children, should families and communities choose to do so. The outline of my talk is talking about common myths and misconceptions, what is forensics, death investigation in Canada, exhumation and repatriation, unidentified remains, and reasonable goals and future prospects. So where I see the forensic work sitting is largely after the ground searches and all the other related work related to the ground searches, because these will outline potential or probable burials where we can focus our forensic work. And then the value of forensic work is that if there's any recovered children, that they can be returned to their families and communities for commemoration that is in keeping with Indigenous ways. So forensics in this context largely falls in four categories: exhumation, identification, cause of death, and expert testimony. And I'll really just focus on the first two today. So I see that there are four common myths and misconceptions around this work. First, that ground penetrating radar is able to locate children's bodies. Ground searches cannot detect the presence of bodies or human remains. And when I'm using the term human remains, I'm referring to dead human body or any portion of a dead body. And this can include an intact skeleton or even bone fragments. However, the information gathered through ground searches can indicate that a burial site may be present, but only exhumation can confirm the presence of human remains. The second myth is that exhumation will allow the recovery of bodies. It is unlikely that whole bodies will actually be recovered. There may be bones present within unmarked burials, and children's bones do not persist as long as adults and may disappear due to the natural breakdown.
Rebecca, this is Craig. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
If you can you put your PowerPoint onto presentation mode so it'll be larger on people's screens?
It is in presentation mode on my side, so is it? Is it still is it in presentation mode now?
It isn't, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm not sure how to correct it because it shows up on mine.
Do you want me to see if I can present it?
Sure. Do you want me to stop sharing?
I think that's working now, Rebecca.
Okay, I'll just ask you to advance to the next slide if you don't mind. So I went over this about the location of forensic work, and we'll move over to the next slide, please. And one more slide. Thank you. So the third myth is that it is possible to identify all human remains. Unfortunately, identification may not be possible. There likely will be very few, if any, identifications. And fourth, the forensic work can be completed in a short time frame. Again, unfortunately, the search, recovery, and identification of your loved ones will take many months and more likely years. And the uncertainty of not knowing the identity of loved ones by families before the confirmed identification is extremely distressing. And I want to say I'm sorry for families that are contemplating doing this forensic work because of this. Next slide, please. So what is forensics? The common conception is that forensic forms a crucial part of evidence for or against guilt. Its origins come from ancient Roman courts relating to courts or relating to law. But there's always been a humanitarian element to our work. For example, even in a homicide case, the forensic experts need to identify the person that has died to ensure that the body is available to the family for funeral or other ceremonies. We also can contribute to the understanding of what happened to a person that has died. Next slide. So forensic work is inherently teamwork. There are many forensic experts that are supported by teams of individuals, such as pathology assistants, technologists, administrators, and we work in partnership with families to get to the common goal of making identification. So some of the experts that you may encounter in this work are forensic pathologists. That's what I am. I'm a medical doctor that performs autopsies on a full range of human remains, including whole bodies, and I work closely with forensic anthropologists when it comes to skeletal or skeleton remains. I also assist in identification, document injuries and diseases to determine its cause of death. Forensic dentists are dentists that assist with identification, diseases, and determine approximate age using teeth. Forensic anthropologists, who we have here today, Dr. Kathy Gressier, are experts in a variety of things, including scientific exhumation to recover skeletal remains. So she has the ability to look at bones and determine what are human bones and separate them from bones from our two-legged and four-legged relatives. She also has the ability to manage commingled skeletal remains. So if in a burial site there's more than one child, she will look at the bones, and if say there's two thigh bones on the left side, then this would indicate that there was at least two individuals in that burial site. Forensic anthropologists also assist in identification, and they determine the presence of trauma in bones. Forensic biologists assist with identification using genetic information from biological family members to human remains. Next slide, please. Forensic experts are connected to death investigation systems for the most part. In Canada, we have two types of death investigation systems, a coroner and a medical examiner. The training of the coroner and medical examiner is different, but their responsibilities are similar. We are experienced in dignified scientific examinations, examinations, and identification of human remains. We issue reports to families, and these can be discussed with experts. We testify in courts of law as expert witnesses, so we are accustomed to our work being highly scrutinized, not only by legal experts, but by peers and others. We use a systematic approach using forensic, medical, and scientific standards. We also have legal powers to obtain records to perform our investigation. And Dr. Williams and I recently hosted a roundtable with leadership in death investigation systems. And there is a willingness to assist Indigenous communities and families in this work if communities would like. Next slide, please. But we do have a lot of challenges. There's no national death investigation system to coordinate a lot of this work. The laws and standards are variable. The experts, resources, and facilities are variable. Additional funding will be needed for this work. and many of the experts are located in the southern part of this country. There's also a lack of wellness support and concerns around trust from Indigenous communities and families. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about trust and death investigation systems in Canada, and this really arose from the National Inquiry into Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls that made it clear that current death investigation systems do not provide proper support for bereaved families. Families are not reliably and systematically provided information on autopsy decisions, inquests, or other processes. For many family members, they are unfamiliar with the death investigation system and process despite murdered Indigenous women being overrepresented. We need to change that. And part of that is to build trust. So forensics, to build trust, must be based on a variety of principles, including prioritizing relationships. This is important because it will aim to create long-term reciprocal and equitable partnerships that can sustain this work. Relational perspective is a worldview of Indigenous people and is a foundation of many Indigenous laws. Humility is also important. The knowledge and expertise of Indigenous knowledge holders and others is crucial to this work. We need to recognize and appreciate reciprocal capacity and expertise. Those involved in the forensic work need to be attuned to the values, norms, expectations, and wisdom of Indigenous partners. In addition, transparency and accountability are important principles, so those who work with Indigenous partners must ensure that their practice is appropriate to the cultural context and interests of Indigenous people. And that includes taking a trauma-informed approach to working with survivors and families and communities. I lost my presentation. I'll just continue. And failure to recognize the cultural needs and cater for cultural differences can have a negative impact and undermine good forensic work. I'll just share this screen again. So moving on to more of the forensic work. So exhumation is the act of digging up something that is buried, usually pertains to human remains. And a lot of work now has identified probable burials by ground search, survivor statements, and other information. And this can mean a couple of things. One, this is not a true burial site, or it's a true burial site with human remains present. Or three, it's a true burial site, and but the bones of the children have disappeared with natural decomposition processes. One of the things that we look to see if it's a burial site in exhumation is normally the soil has multiple layers of different colors and textures. And when a burial is dug up, that soil gets intermixed. And when it's placed back into the site that's been dug, the features of the colors and the texture is different actually to the adjacent soil. And this allows us to determine if there's been a grade cut. The options for exhumation include not exhuming, which I've heard from some communities don't want to do, but exhumation, which can be a destructive process. We are removing the land. It can be staged or not staged, and the options depend on the environment and location of human remains. So I've just basically taken the process of exhumation and examination and identification and broken them down. And these could be stopped at any point, given agreement on the method by families and communities. So we can start with removing the top surface of the land, look for the grave cut, and we can continue on to remove all of the land to see if there are indeed human remains in that burial site. Then from there, if there is any human remains, or personal effects, they are removed from the burial site and put into a secure location where we can examine the human remains and personal effects in an area with good lighting and documentation. And then you can go on to take a sample for identification, and finally repatriation and burial. For the examination of human remains and personal effects, this usually occurs in a secure area like a mortuary. If human remains are present, they will likely be bones. The information that can be gathered from the bones, depending on their state, include a biological profile, estimate age, estimate biological sex, the number of individuals in a burial site, if there's any trauma or diseases. And once the examination is over and families want to proceed with identification, collecting a sample for identification. So the identification process is really a comparative process, comparing the post-mortem information data set with the ante-mortem data set, so information from death and comparing it with information in life. So this includes the information that we gathered from the remains that we recovered, and identification starts there at the exhumation, and information gathered from the post-mortem examination. And this is compared to any of the missing person data in order to achieve a successful identification. The DNA samples that are necessary for identification process come from comparing samples from biological relatives to samples that are collected from the bones and teeth of the children. So the sample that we collect from family members would include blood or a buccal swab, which is just a swab on the inner surface of the cheek. The challenges with this is that we need available biological relatives, but they also need to be willing to consent to the process. And this is where I think there's a good opportunity for partnership of Indigenous communities and forensic experts to consider what do they want in the consent form? What do they want the consent process to look like? What do they think about custodianship? The other challenge with DNA is that it cannot distinguish siblings. We'll also need information about the missing person, their families, and communities can provide that, survivor statements, archival, and other records. For the postmortem sample, the challenges here is destructive. Usually we have to cut into the bone, for example, to collect a sample where DNA can be extracted. The DNA must also be present in good quality, but even if that happens, the land may have interfered with our technique. The postmortem information from sex and age estimations can be really good to separate siblings. So say you have a 16-year-old sister and a 4-year-old sister, the age estimations can help distinguish them where DNA has that limitation. And finally, personal effects. So once these children are identified, we need to inform family members that have been previously decided before all this work has started. And this may also require travel within provinces and also the logistics of between provinces so that families can bury their loved ones. I also want to take a moment to talk about the real possibility of unidentified human remains. We need to decide if human remains are present, but we're unable to identify them despite exhaustive effort. So we might not be able to get a good DNA sample. We might not be able to find living biological relatives. We need to decide the next step before exhumation. I think many of us would agree that we don't want these children in secure facilities for decades if they cannot be identified. So what are reasonable goals and future prospects? I think the value of the forensic work is that we can recover these children and honor and commemorate them. It's also an opportunity to scientifically correlate with historical records and learn more about the children. And it's also an opportunity to build capacity in Indigenous communities and Indigenous police services. So opportunities to learn about the death investigation process, have a say in, for example, creation of the consent form for DNA samples, but also Indigenous police services, which were created as a form of self-governance. Many Indigenous police services do not investigate criminally suspicious deaths. So this would give the opportunity for them to have experience in this work. So things to consider before exhumation. I think because Indigenous people are the knowledge keepers in our protocols and our laws, we need to create protocols of engagement to address the potential cultural gulf between Indigenous peoples and the forensic team in order to formalize this partnership. Protocols can involve ceremony, praying, also being an Indigenous way of bearing witness, and for the forensic experts to adhere to these. 2, a willingness of affected biological families to provide DNA samples for the purposes of identification of recovered human remains. 3, how unidentified children will be honored and commemorated. And 4, the intention to pursue accountability through legal systems in the event that forensic work results in evidence that could be used in criminal prosecution. The legal system, although forensic experts interact with it, and were subpoenaed to testify, this is largely the work of others. As a forensic pathologist, I don't make arrests of others, for example. And also consider the impact on families and communities at every step of the way. And those who want to learn more about the forensic work and an overview of it, over the summer, I created a document, quite extensive for those who want to have a lot of details, that will be available on the National Advisory Committee website shortly, and a link will be sent for every registrant. But there's also a shorter one, a one two-pager for those that want the highlights of the report. And I put this picture of this bald eagle in the corner because after I completed the report, I spent 2 weeks outside typing away, contemplating how this work should be done. And finally, this bald eagle came into my yard and sat on the tree, and I was able to snap a photo. Thank you, that's it. I think your mic is off.
Okay, am I on now? Yeah. So thank you, Rebecca. That was a lot of information. And I know some of these topics can be quite heavy. So I just wanted to remind everyone that's participating that we've brought up the contact for the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line on our chat. And also we've identified a virtual talk-in circle with Sandra Delaron, who is the health support worker, and she's available, during the session and also an hour after the webinar. So the information and link in is also in the chat. And I just want to thank you again, Rebecca, because this information can be quite hard. It's a hard topic, but it's, the background that you shared is really needed, because as we move forward, I think at times, being delivering that policing service into our Indigenous communities can be quite challenging. And yes, a lot of the Indigenous police services, they don't investigate the criminal serious criminal investigations, and sometimes we need to, figure out ways of connecting and working with all of those that do provide that type of service. So with that, thank you very much. Our next presenter is Dr. Kono Williams, and I'd like to just pass on the mic to her and for her presentation. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if I can get this going. Am I able to share my screen?
It's not on yet.
Okay, hang on here.
Okay, it is on now.
All right. Okay. So good afternoon, good morning to everybody. I thank you for listening in today, and thank you for Monica and Harley for the introductions as well. My name's Kona. I'm Korean Mohawk, as Harley introduced me. But today I'm going to talk, sort of following up on what Dr. Jocks had talked about, and what's really involved with, the realities of forensic investigation should people decide to go that route. Forensic death investigation is not an easy decision. To proceed with an investigation of this nature, it's going to be hard. Many discussions are going to have to happen between nations and communities, families, survivors, about how you want to proceed. For this to happen, we need to give you the information about the kind of work that's involved, the time it can take, as well as the possible outcomes, and with it, the limitations, in order to make the best decision for yourselves. I'm going to be completely honest. The death investigation system has not always been kind or fair, compassionate, or considerate with Indigenous peoples. And that's obvious across the country. But we are here. Our involvement depends on the decisions that you make. And my intent today is to share this information with you freely. A copy of this presentation will be available for any of you and all of you who want to have this information. The forensic expertise required. You are going to need the expertise of forensic pathologists and forensic anthropologists. Dr. Grispier, who I've worked with on many cases over the years, is an invaluable source of information and an invaluable resource. She has years, decades of experience, and so her knowledge and expertise are greatly appreciated. You're going to require other experts. So it's not just us, pathology assistants, archaeologists, technicians, technologists. There's a lot of people that work together as a team to be able to do this work. The National Advisory Committee, which I'm a part of, is here to help provide information, oversight, advice, and advice to families and communities and nations who are thinking about doing this. There are many options available, but if people are thinking of going to a forensic investigation, there's a lot of information you need to know before making that decision. These are the phases, the basic phases of any forensic approach. The families, communities, and leadership must be engaged. So this cannot just sort of happen without talking with you, without discussions, without communication. There's governance, there's oversight, there's local action plans. Each scene, each site is going to be different. There's medical and bioethics involved. And then there has to be ceremony. And this is possible. We have learned this at other gatherings, that communities, families, survivors can be involved in this. It shouldn't be cordoned off so that nobody knows what's going on. Archival documents, research, interviews. We know that there are survivors out there who, weren't able to or didn't feel ready to share their stories with the TRC. But those stories might be important now. So I would encourage people to share if they feel comfortable. But there are documents that we need to review. There's research that needs to happen. There needs to be a collection of ante-mortem, so before death, so in life, ante-mortem data from prospective families. This can include DNA and will likely include DNA. That's a whole other topic, which, there's a whole other process for that. And we're still working on how that's going to work, to be honest. Multidisciplinary teams need to be available to exhume and examine remains, identification, repatriation, and then management of unidentified remains. These are sort of the phases that we need to think about. What's an autopsy? A lot of people want to know what this is and what it entails. So it's also known as a post-mortem examination. It's the examination of the body after death. There's 5 basic steps: history, scene, circumstances. So gathering information about the person, about what happened, where were they, what happened around their death. And in this case, a lot of that is going to be from the archives. But we will also consider witness statements as well. These are important. External examination, we look at the body, and in this case, it will most likely be bones. And that will tie in with an internal examination. So for a regular autopsy, when we have a complete person, we do open the body, remove the organs, look at everything. We document everything. When you're dealing with bones, you don't have all those organs. You're really left with bones. And so this is where forensic anthropology colleagues come into play and are so important to this. We do testing. So this can be looking at tissues under the microscope. It can be sending off, various samples for testing for toxicology, for example. Radiology, we can look at, the bones from a CT scan or in an X-ray. And we may ask other people to help us. So again, anthropology, odontology, archaeology, we can help these people help us to get as much information, as many medical and scientific facts as we can about the individual in order to get to the last step, which is a summary and opinion. Basically the goal of the autopsy is help determine the cause and the manner of death. And this can get a little bit tricky. The cause of death is very, very specific. Essentially, it's the initiating event that ultimately leads to death. This can be really simple. So, for example, a gunshot wound to chest. Somebody gets shot in the chest, they die, they have injuries to the organs on the inside. It's very straightforward. It can be a lot more complex than that. And so I'm not going to read out all that to you, but we may have to consider other things that have happened before, pre-existing diseases, other conditions, and that can stretch over weeks, months, or even years. The manner of death seems pretty straightforward. There are 5: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, undetermined. And the manner of death is a judgment call based on all the information that's been gathered during a death investigation, which can include the autopsy report. The manner is determined either by a medical examiner or a coroner, depending on what system is in place in your province or territory. I have a lot of points to consider. This isn't exhaustive, but they're important. There are likely unmarked burial sites at all 139 recognized Indian residential schools across the country. And we know that there are other schools that are not recognized by the federal government currently, which may also have burial sites. There are other sites aside from those schools: day schools, industrial schools, Indian hospitals, reformatories. I've heard horrible stories of summer camps where children were taken and some of them didn't return. There may be many other sites that we're not aware of. But with an investigation like this, you do have to consider that, as well as the location and how a forensic investigation might proceed. Children from different communities were often moved around under different names, numbers, without any accurate records, and that can make it really hard to find somebody. There are hundreds and hundreds of nations across this country, and there are different ceremonial protocols around death for each of them, and even variations. My mother's community in Ganawage has different practices than Aguazaste or Ganastage, for example. Communities and nations may have opposing views about exhumation, but what happens if there are children buried in the same location? These are where the difficult conversations are going to come in, and there needs to be that discussion between nations about how you want to honor your children. From my perspective, the wishes of the families and communities are paramount. The extent of our involvement depends on what you decide. The forensic works needs an approach. There is a systematic approach on best practices that align with the ethics. And we need to hold these ethics to the living and the dead. Each step must respect the cultural and traditional values of each community. And that's going to be tough, because technically, traditionally, death investigations didn't really do that, or weren't very good at it. You need to know that it's likely not going to be possible to locate all grave sites. We're probably not going to be able to identify each child and determine an exact cause of death. And that's going to be hard, because, after a full forensic investigation, and if we do find the bones of children, we may be left with a cause and manner of death listed as undetermined, because we simply do not have enough evidence to say exactly how somebody died and why. Again, I know this is difficult. This is hard information. Again, I give this information to you freely. I was taught that when you come to the table with gifts, you share them. And I will share this with you. This is artwork from my friend Jackie out in Winnipeg. I wanted something special for this kind of work, and all I had was an orange circle, and she came up with this in half an hour. So kudos to my friend Jackie. But to all of you, you can have this. I have another document that I'm preparing, which is in plain language, and I want this to be available to everybody, to all of you. And I am available for questions. I'm always happy to talk to people, to share, the benefit of all the training I've done. I didn't do this just to keep it all to myself. I did this to share with you. Nyawa, miigwech, merci, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kona. And that was a lot of information, and I just feel so grateful that you're able to share that with us. And sometimes it's difficult to hear, but one of the things that I working with a lot of elders, with my time, whether I was in policing or health, one of the important things is that you touched on was that each step must be be cultural and traditional values of the community, and that's important, because those traditional protocols are important in every step of this work, and they help guide us also, and help us understand the significance of what we're doing. So thank you for that. So I just wanted to I don't know, I might have forgot to remind everyone earlier, but all the everyone that's online, I like to let you know that we will be taking questions after all the presentations are completed, and invite people to write their questions in the chat at any time, and also towards the end would be great. And one of the things I just wanted to step back a little bit on is I mentioned earlier was, we have pulled together an extensive list of resources, such as videos and FAQs and background papers around many of the key elements of the search process. We have also published a short introductory overview of navigating community options. This is all available on the website, and on the chat line right now, we have that posted, and the website is www.nac-cnn.ca. Oh, thank you. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kathy Guspier and you know, pass it over to her for her presentation. And we look forward to hearing you know, and share and what you have to share with us. So I'll pass it to Dr. Kathy Guspier. So Kathy, your mic is still off. You might want to turn your mic on to your camera.
Oh. Oh.
Okay, I can see you now, and I think your mic is off, so it's all yours, Kathy.
They just turned it on. I'm not sure if anyone can hear me, but it looks like nobody else is connected. And I'm not sure if it's my issue or someone else's.
Well, I can hear you clear and see you clearly at this point. Yeah, you're good.
You can hear me, Kona? And it looks like Harley is not connected.
I can hear you. Are you able to hear me?
I don't hear anybody else, but I see you shaking your head.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I'll let our technicians, Craig, sort of look at that and maybe, you know, figure this out. We give them a couple of minutes here.
Kathy, it looks like you're very clear on screen, it appears, and your sound is clear. So I think it may be just how the rest of the webinar is appearing to you.
Okay, because all I see is, okay, I just see everybody's not connected. I can see Kona, I see Harley's mic, but that's it. So I'm just waiting for somebody to say something, I guess.
I think we're okay. I think that's an artifact, but I think it's okay.
Okay, so would you like me to start my presentation then?
Yes, that'd be great.
And, Kathy, sorry, this is Craig. There's a message from our tech support asking you to refresh your page. That might help resolve the problem.
Okay.
We'll give you a moment while that happens.
Yes, sorry. Everything was fine.
I think while we're waiting for Kathy to come on, just to remind everyone that, you know, these topics can be quite heavy and pieces of it can be quite hard to hear and difficult. So I just wanted to
Kathy, you're back on screen, but we lost Harley.
Yes, I noticed something happened there. And I see everybody looks better now, except I don't see Harley.
On Harley's behalf, they will ask you to go ahead, and we'll get Harley back.
Okay. Oh, let's hope this works.
Yeah, I am back, so I don't know if you can hear me. So we'll let you start your presentation, Kathy.
Okay, I'm just trying to find it.
And apologize for the technical difficulties, and just ask you for your patience as we continue.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet.
Kathy, do you want me to try sharing it from my screen?
Yeah, it's looking for a tab, but okay, yes, please. I've held things up for a while, so please do.
Yeah, we have it on the screen now.
Okay. Okay, well, good day, everyone. I'd like to thank everybody for inviting me to be here for this very interesting session. And I'd like to particularly thank my colleagues Kona and Rebecca for providing sort of a background into death investigation. And I'm specifically going to speak about forensic anthropology. Um, and I'll start out by saying I hope that this presentation can help inform any decisions that you make going forward. I will say this again at the end, but all the decisions, whether to go forward or not in exhuming these children, are yours and yours alone. And we are just here to assist you should you require any of our expertise. Next slide, please. So usually it's good to start out with a definition, particularly because most people I meet have no idea what I do. And they say, what's that? So I start out by a definition. This is a very general one. Forensic anthropology is the study of humans using biological, social, and cultural anthropology to assist with the identification of both the living and the dead. Now, I particularly deal with the dead, but a lot of my colleagues also deal with the living. It also includes the archaeological recovery and repatriation of the deceased, and the interpretation of circumstances surrounding death. And that's in concert with my other colleagues, as you have heard from Kona and Rebecca. What forensic anthropologists also do is we work within the justice system. So we provide evidence to courts in our area of expertise. And we very much also work in the humanitarian realm, particularly in other countries, but also here. Most of my cases, a lot of my cases, are not murders or homicides, but simply human remains that need to be returned to their families. And that is part of something that forensic anthropology can assist with. Now, forensic anthropology, initially, we don't have a very long history. It's still a very evolving area of expertise. But initially, we were sought out to be used for skeletons only because our expertise is within the human skeleton. That's what we know very well. Or we were utilized to make use of our archaeological expertise in order to retrieve buried bodies. Now, over the years that I've been doing this, and it has been like, Kona, thank you for making me sound so old, decades, but I am. In any case, over the time that I've been doing this, the role of forensic anthropology, at least in Ontario, has evolved to include questions of whether bones may be human or non-human. And this is something that is actually found on a daily basis. People find bones and they're not sure. And we can help the police out with that very quickly just by looking at a photograph. We also make determinations about whether found human remains are of recent forensic interest or not. And that means whether or not they are an ongoing case, a recent case, or something from the past, for instance, archaeological. Now, I understand from some people that I work with that this term recent forensic interest has not been received very well by certain individuals. And I would just like to take a moment here, because some of you may be listening, to explain where this term came from. I actually coined this term, and it was the result of an investigation that I was called in on a number of years ago. An individual who was exploring caves in the Saugeen Nation came upon some burials in the cave. He removed some bones and then had a fit of, feeling badly about what he had done, took them to a cemetery, deposited them on top of a grave, and then called the police. I attended the cemetery with the police and found some human remains, and also some artifacts and clothing, not fragments of material that suggested that these remains were not not someone who had recently died. What I also saw was that there was trauma to the individual's skull that had occurred around the time of death. So I spoke to the police. We determined that there was nothing we could do about investigating that now. And the remains were returned to the appropriate nation for reburial. The next day in the newspaper, an article was published saying police refused to investigate 100-year-old homicide of Indigenous woman. And so I came up with the term recent forensic interest only to denote that this was of forensic interest, this case. This woman had been murdered, or had died by accident sometime in the past, but that the case was not recent. So hopefully that's understandable. The investigations that you are looking into doing are something entirely different, and I don't feel that they need to be labeled with a term such as recent forensic interest or not. The investigation into the residential schools burials is something entirely different. So I would not use this term to describe this investigation. We also, forensic anthropologists, are usually called in to deal with any bodies that are not visually identifiable. So if you look at the body and they don't look, that can't be identified by you, anthropology can offer some assistance in that regard. And these would be specifically decomposed bodies, bodies that have been badly burned in fires, but also very fresh bodies where we have no idea who the person might be. Forensic anthropologists are also heavily involved in recovery of human remains from fire scenes. I personally, and also some of my colleagues, have been involved in a number of the tragic fires that have occurred on reserves in the past few years. So we are very used to going into the communities. We are very used to speaking to the council, the elders, the community, and the families. And I will say we are also very amenable to ceremony, and we provide as much opportunity for that to occur before we remove the remains for autopsy. And we ensure that we get them back in a very timely fashion. So that's just to say that, and Kona alluded to this, that ceremony is something we're already used to taking into account in these types of investigations. Forensic anthropologists can also perform identifications by looking at X-rays or CT scans or MRI scans that were taken of the person during life and compare them to what we see after death. And specifically, we have an expertise in tool mark analysis of dismembered remains. Next slide, please. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Kathy.
Okay, can I have the next slide, please?
The slide that we have on is other non-casework. Is that the slide?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm looking at mine. Oh dear. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are some other things that forensic anthropologists do, and in particularly my job in Toronto is to design and maintain a multiple fatality plan for our unit in Toronto, and participate in multiple fatality planning for the province. This is very important. We deal with multiple fatalities all the time, including those fires on reserves, and we have a particular scientific way of managing those. I also manage long-term unidentified remains. I have some consultants that I manage. Education, training, and teaching. I'm an associate professor in laboratory medicine in Toronto, and research whenever we have the time. The next slide, please. So the forensic anthropologist has the great opportunity to not only work in the laboratory, but also to go to the scene. And what we do at a scene of found remains, be it buried remains or perhaps remains that are found scattered on the surface, is that we ensure that there's correct forensic mapping and documentation and recovery of the remains. What we can do is provide an inventory of skeletal remains at the scene, and we can advise the search team or police on, do we need to look further? What do we have and what are we missing? We also are experts in assessing the environment in order to determine how long the person might have been dead. And that could be a burial environment or an open, in the woods or on the surface. Finally, I think, and this is a very important part of our job, we ensure the complete recovery and protection for transport of remains to our facility. And this is particularly important when you're dealing with very badly burned remains. We don't want to introduce any other trauma. We want to ensure that we have all the information that we need at the postmortem in order to do our examinations and identify the person. All right, so the next slide, please. So once we have remains into our facility, what we would do beyond the postmortem and beyond is the forensic anthropologist, and this has already been alluded to, we determine what is called group biology of a single, let's say we're dealing with a single individual right now. So that would be age at death, biological sex, ancestry, and the living height of the individual. What we can also do is look over the skeleton for what we call personal biology. And these would be just different variants that people may have on their skeletons. Every single one of us is different, as you know, if you look around, the room or look around outside. Everybody looks a bit different. Your skeletons all pretty much look a little bit different as well. We can also look at healed trauma and disease on skeletal remains. In particular for cases that are going to go to court, criminally suspicious cases, we can reconstruct and document perimortem trauma that occurred around the time of death and may have contributed to death. So for instance, whether it's sharp force trauma, stabbing, etc., blunt force trauma, gunshot wounds, etc., and we can do some interpretation of that. And we share this with the forensic pathologist. We also look at what happened to a body after death, what the environment may have done to the body, whether or not animals scavenged a body, whether something else has happened to the body. They've been subjected, for instance, to water for an extensive amount of time. And finally, we can undertake positive identifications by the antemortem and postmortem imaging. And I also have an expertise in DNA for interpretation, so that's part of my job. So next slide, please. And now what I'm going to do for this next, I have to speed up a little bit. Next part of my investigation is specifically address the residential schools burials. So hopefully you have some idea of the general background and what we can offer. At this point in time, because a lot of ground penetrating radar has been done, what we need to do next, and again, this is again at your decision and at your discretion, but the next step in general will be what we call ground truthing. And that's to actually determine what is under the ground that's showing up in a ground penetrating radar scan. Forensic anthropologists are familiar with these and what they look like. We can read the outputs of the radar, work with the ground penetrating radar people, get their opinions, etc. So there are a number of things that can be done going forward. And I've put these out for your consideration as you try to make a decision about what you would like to do. To begin with, what we can do is remove the topsoil to expose what's being shown up on the ground penetrating radar as an anomaly. So normally in archaeology in Ontario and elsewhere in the country, we would use heavy equipment to do this, or it can be done by hand. As soon as you remove the topsoil, you are going to be able to see whether or not there is a grave there. You don't have to dig any further. It will be very obvious. Rebecca mentioned as a feature is created, people dig down, the soil gets churned up, there are different colors, and these graves will be extremely obvious. They will not have disappeared. The time has not been that long. So you will essentially see an outline of different color, not just suggesting, but indicating that there is a grave there. If you wanted to take things a step further, you might consider excavation of the grave in order to reveal the contents. So you could go down to the coffin or the individual, I'm speaking specifically now about graves, and prove to yourself that there is a coffin there. This is a grave. It's not just a rectangular distinction in the soil. Can I have the next slide, please? What you could do next is to expose the remains. And that way you can be assured that there is actually a human being in the grave. The next stage you might want to consider is a slight disturbance of the remains. This will allow for determination of age. We can leave the remains in the grave and remove just a long bone or two, take a handheld x-ray of the teeth, and we can tell you how old the child is. If you would like to go further, we can do excavation and analysis of the remains on the site. They can remain in the area. We can set up a mobile morgue, and they can be analyzed on the site. And finally, as has been spoken about by my colleagues, we can do excavation and analysis of remains in a full-service forensic facility, which gives us access to all of the equipment and all of the things that we may need in order to give the best answers that we can to you. But there are things that we can answer all along the way of these steps that I have given you an option for. Next slide, please. Now, from the point of view of forensic anthropology, the forensic examination can determine a number of things, and I am giving you the specifics of what we can do and not do. We can determine the age at death of the individual, and by this we do measurements of bone and development of teeth. We can determine the sex of the individual. However, this can only be done with older teens and adults. We cannot determine sex from the bones of young children that have not yet reached puberty. The only way to do that reliably is by DNA. We can determine ancestry of the remains. Again, this can only be done with older teens and adults or by DNA. We can look at what diseases or what trauma the individual may have suffered during their life. And this can only be determined if they left their mark on bone, if we're only dealing with skeletons. A lot of diseases like cholera, flu, even pulmonary tuberculosis will kill somebody very quickly before they leave their mark on the bones. We can't just assume that all of these burials are going to be complete skeletons. There may be some in a better state of preservation, and that could be due to the environmental factors in the grave itself. And if so, we can do more with those bodies. We will have access to other tissues. Next slide, please. So just to summarize that, depending on the extent of the examination, a general biological profile is all that can be determined by a forensic anthropologist looking at human skeletal remains. Next slide, please. With regards to individual identification, we rely on a number of evidence-based methods, and those are fingerprints, dental records, ante-mortem imaging before death, as I mentioned earlier, and DNA. Now, obviously, some of these are not going to be available with the children. There may actually be some dental records, but I really don't know about that. I don't think we'll find any fingerprints, nor would we have anything to compare them to. Next slide, please. Rebecca spoke a little bit about DNA, and I just wanted to also flag some issues that you should be aware of. You should be aware that we do have to remove a portion of bone or tooth from the remains. So this is a little bit destructive, and we do have to do that in order to get the DNA. Even if we do remove these pieces of bone or tooth, getting an actual usable profile, meaning that we can get enough DNA in order to do a comparison, may be difficult given the amount of time that some of these children may have been in the ground. In general, and there are what are called libraries of DNA. So there are certain types of DNA that are more prominent in certain communities or more likely to be found. So if you were just looking generally for ancestry, Indigenous DNA profiles are not well represented in these libraries. Specifically, a result may not individuate a person. So we may not be able to say, this is definitely this child, but it may only indicate a family relationship. And that is because in families, a lot of DNA is shared. So we may not be able to actually give a name to a child, but we should be able to confirm that they came from a specific larger family group or community if we can get DNA from the remains. Next slide, please. So I just have a couple of just some issues to be aware of, and then a final slide. You should be aware that, and you may already know this, that these anomalies or these that you see on the ground penetrating radar cannot be relied upon to indicate true size or shape of an anomaly. They may look like a rectangle, it may look like a grave, but you cannot rely upon that as representing the true shape of what is under the ground. You have to ground truth at least to remove the topsoil to do that. I did watch a news release a little while back of one of the communities that's looking at drilling into the soil for DNA samples from potential individuals that may be buried there. I personally would not advise that, and this is my own opinion. You're going in blind to a feature. You don't really know what the source of DNA is. There could be clothing or materials from another individual in there. And it's also destructive in an uncontrollable way. They need to get a good size sample of an individual. And, you don't know. You're going in blind. You don't know what you're drilling into. So I just, I thought I would just share that with you. I personally found it a little upsetting that this was, but that's just me. Also, you may not be able to identify a specific child, as I have already mentioned. We may not be able to determine the manner or the cause of death, as Kona and Rebecca have said, as we are not dealing with the complete body. And you should also know that not all forensic anthropologists are created equally. There are no exams to write to be a forensic anthropologist. There's no specific training that one has to undertake. And if you are considering using a forensic anthropologist, you should very carefully consider what their knowledge and their experience is, because anybody can hang up their shingle in my area of expertise. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. Whatever decisions are taken by you on how or if you wish to delve further into this investigation, the forensic anthropologist, not just me, but others like me, are here as part of the team of death investigators to assist you. We are always ready to help you. We are ready to answer your questions. We can give you as much or as little information as you require. I don't mean little, I mean not as very specific. As you have seen today, I have not included any photographs in my presentation, and I very much tend to speak to photos, but I am aware that a general audience finds that very difficult to view. Jury members find it very difficult to view. So my colleagues and I in the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service are ready to help you in any way you can. And hopefully I can provide my email address if any of you would like to contact me directly. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't taken too much extra time, and I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And the information you provided was incredible. There's a lot of detail there, and it gives us a sense of, just how much work there is to do when we started working on that stage of it. And also, I appreciate your clarifying the term recent forensic interest, because, as a police officer in my past life, that was always a challenge, because one of my postings was having to deal with a lot of remains that were found on various islands that the tourists picked up along the way, and mailed back to us. And we worked closely with the community and the traditional people, and used traditional protocol on returning those remains. So thank you again, Kathy. That was a lot of information, and that was great. So, I guess at this point, I just want to remind everyone that, we will be taking questions, and invite you to write your questions on a chat at any time. And just as a reminder, this webinar is hosted by the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials. You can find a lot of the background information on our website, which is www.nac-cnn.ca, and we'll put it up again on our chat. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please take a moment to write them down. on the chat, and we'll start with the various questions that do come up. But I'd like to maybe ask a couple questions before we get started there, and I have one directive for Rebecca. Rebecca, you've described various fields of forensics. As you said, they're all based on Western science and traditions. I'm interested in how these disciplines might interact with Indigenous science and knowledge systems.
Thanks for that question. I think the first thing that strikes me is I think the writing will be less dry in scientific papers for incorporating Indigenous sciences. And the traditional science is largely based on Descartes, which is a philosopher who divides the mind and body. And a lot of traditional sciences really focus on physical things, the body. But Indigenous sciences really just incorporate all of that, but also have a relational component to lands, waters, and other relatives that we have. And I think we can extract better community implications for science rather than the Western medicine that really focuses on a specific area, very reductionistic. And then finally, I think the final product will be more diverse and allow for a better overall product in science.
Okay, thank you. And I was wondering if Kona and Kathy, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, sure. Like I grew up knowing, um, you know, the elders, the medicine people, in my mom's community specifically, and it's a very different way of seeing a human being, um, and not just a human being like we're looking at each other, but seeing who they really are, what is going on with them, and seeing deeper. And traditional Western medicine has typically kind of ignored that, whereas Dr. Jacques had kind of pointed out it's been very compartmentalized. And there are absolutely ways to treat an individual with both Western medicine and Western science and traditional medicine. I have um, no concerns that that's possible, and it's already being done. Uh, the whole goal is to make the person feel better. That's the point. So there shouldn't be any clash between the two. When you're talking about the deaths of children and potentially exhuming remains and disturbing the dead, I do think that ceremony, culture, language, protocol are integral to this process. It has to be. And this is going to be it's going to create a different path that historically hasn't really been very respectful with Indigenous people in terms of death investigation systems. So I think there are paths we can take, and we can take those together. And I am hoping that this will open doors to fixing or making the death investigation better, to better serve Indigenous people and all people, to be quite frank. This is possible.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to Kathy for your comments.
Thank you. I truly believe that we can continue to evolve in forensic medicine and forensic science. It's what we do. It really is a relatively young area of medicine and science. And I personally have changed my mind by listening to my colleagues. I remember very many years ago, before I became interested in forensics, I remember sitting at a Canadian Archaeological Association meeting and speaking with one of my Indigenous archaeology colleagues and learning the difference between how he viewed the remains of his ancestors and how I did. And it was a really eye-opening moment for me. And I said, well, how do you know that, if you're not going to look at the remains and you're not going to look for disease and you're not going to decide whether it's male or female? And he said, well, we don't actually need that because we can speak to the ancestors and we can understand through the stories what we need to know. And I realized right then that, well, right then it seemed like a brick wall to me, but over the years, and particularly with my involvement in the fires in the First Nations communities, I've come to see how, it's just a matter of recognizing what people need and allowing them to do it. We can modify and we can be inclusive to, to what we do. It's not difficult to do that. We just need to listen to people. And as my colleagues have mentioned, particularly Kona, we have a history of always being in the basement and hiding what we do. And, we work for the police and the justice system. We can't tell anybody anything. But, so it's something that we need to pay attention to. And I have no problem whatsoever with listening to what people want and need, and doing my best to incorporate that into the practices that I do on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you're right. We really need to take the time to listen and ask those questions as we need to I guess to raise a higher level understanding as we're providing these types of supports and as we're investigating. So I thank you for all your comments. And we do have a question here from Amanda Sutherland. I wanted to thank everyone. This is not an easy topic to discuss. The question I have is about having the funding to find and gathering the remains of all the missing children. Is the government providing the funds to also delivering the remains of the children back to their homes, families, communities? Kona?
Yeah, so as Dr. Jacques mentioned earlier, we did have a discussion with the National Death Investigation Leadership. And there are a number of the systems who offer that, yes, they would help repatriate the remains, even from different provinces. It is my belief that this burden of funding and finding the funds to do this work should not be shouldered by the communities and nations. This was inflicted on people, and this, in my opinion, the funds to cover this work should come from the very institutions who created the situation in the first place. Whether or not that actually happens, I don't know, but I'm a strong believer in this and that they should.
Okay, thank you, Kona. Any comments from Rebecca or Kathy on this?
I would just say that I agree with Kona. And I think if anything does go forward, at least in Ontario, and a decision is made to bring this under the umbrella of our current death investigation system, then there will not be an issue with funding to return children to their families.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would put my hat in the ring too. Yeah, I agree. This shouldn't be on the shoulders of families to fund this. And there's a lot of precedent in Ontario for us to fund return of people that have died in our system to their families.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And the next question is from Terry Lugo. My question is around the limitations of identifying certain aspects until they are teenagers or adults, and in brackets, other than DNA. Is this primarily because of human development?
I guess that's for me.
Yeah.
Yes. Until puberty, there are no biological sexual differences that are exhibited in the skeleton. So little boys and little girls essentially look the same. So it occurs with the hormonal changes around puberty, where we start to see the differences, particularly in the skull and also the pelvis of individuals. And they're differences in other parts of the body as well. Just as you can tell the difference if you look, and I'm only speaking of biological sex, not gender. Gender is a cultural construct, which is something that we cannot approach, nor should we, when someone is not alive to indicate it to us. But if you look, at an unclothed adult male and an adult female, we all know what the differences are. It's the same thing with a skeleton, but you don't see the differences. I guess that's not a good analogy, because there are differences with little boys and little girls, but skeletally, there is no difference to determine sex.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. And maybe just to add on to that, when you talk about DNA and be able to identify ancestry, on older, teens and adults, I'm just, a question is there enough, DNA information available to determine ancestry and at what level? Is it more, I guess, could they identify the remains by location, by community, or by nation? So I guess, Kathy, if you can respond to that, or Rebecca.
I'll dive in. Yes. I mention ancestry because it's something that forensic anthropologists do as part of our job. However, given this specific project, specific inquiry, that there are certain residential schools where certain children from certain communities were sent. That's a lot of certains. So the issue of ancestry is not particularly of concern, I believe. And really not knowing how distinct these cemeteries would be from any other, perhaps, community cemetery where other community members would be buried. If they are specific to the residential schools and the children that died there, I don't really think ancestry is going to be something that is a major consideration to determine.
Okay, alrighty. Anybody else have comments on that? Okay, I'm just trying to sort of focus on the questions at this point, and I think there's been some response from Tamara, and one of them is, but not all children have identified through the system, like all the institutions are not listed. And then another one where I meant to say that not all people have been identified through the system. Is there funding available to complete such a task if an institution has not been recognized on the list? And I think Kona's already responded online, but if you can respond on chat, but if you can respond online, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of the government's only recognizing, the 139 schools, and they're not recognizing other sites. We're probably going to find other sites, in places like Indian hospitals, for example. And again, I don't think this financial burden should be placed on the people who suffered this. This should be covered, in this case, by the government and or the church. That's my opinion on this.
Okay. Any comments from Kathy or Rebecca on that? Okay. The next question is, what about using equipment to shift through materials for human remains? Would you recommend that?
I just responded to that in the chat. Okay. I wasn't entirely clear what he was asking, but I would not recommend using anything except for careful excavation by hand to go through soil to look for human remains.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So I have a question for you guys. So In Rebecca's presentation, she talked about some of the myths and misconceptions about forensic. I would like to ask Kona and Kathy about some of the misunderstandings that you've encountered in your work. So I'll start off
Kona,
with
you
Kona.
go first.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I get them all the time. I get them like, people think it's like CSI and that there's just one person doing all the work, and that's not true. We work as a team. I get questions about, can we determine time of death, like right down to the minute? No, that's actually really hard to do. Um, that forensic pathologists and forensic anthropologists, we're not doctors or we're not qualified. Absolutely we are. I will say that there aren't enough of us, and forensics is not, especially for medical students, for people thinking about science, it's not usually the first thing that they think about, because it's not like they don't have all those really cool TV shows like ER or Grey's Anatomy. But for those of you who are considering this, um, try it. We need you, and to come visit us, come talk to us. And for any youth who are considering doing this, you can. I'm not a genius by any stretch of the imagination. I was just really stubborn, as my dad told me. So I would welcome you. Come learn, see what we do, learn about us, because we absolutely need you.
Okay, thank you. Kathy?
Well, essentially it's the same thing as Kona. The misconceptions are based largely on popular television shows like Bones, in my case, and where we have all these fancy instruments and we solve cases within 35 minutes or whatever. And surprisingly, juries have some of these misconceptions as well. Well, it's not surprising. So essentially, that's the kind of thing I would encounter as well. And I would offer the same as Kona. Please feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to email, to call, to whatever if you want to learn some more. I was also going to, and I will, Harley, provide a couple of references to two websites that give a more general overview of forensic anthropology if you would like that.
Yeah, and that'd be good. And we could have our technicians put on the chat line. That'd be great.
Great.
And Rebecca, do you have any further comments on this?
Yeah, I agree. We have a really cool job in medicine. I say it's the coolest job in medicine. And yeah, happy to chat with anyone that's interested in becoming a forensic pathologist or related to death investigation.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, that was certainly an interesting perspective when I was policing and being able to connect and ask those questions and gain a better level of understanding. And that's important. It sort of opens us up to be able to see what that work entails. So there's another question here from Liz, and it's what about using cadaver dogs for primary search? So I'll open up for the panelists.
I can give an opinion on that.
Okay, Kathy.
Cadaver dogs I actually use very much in investigations. We have a wonderful, and as you mentioned, Harley, police learning. What I didn't actually stress very strongly was the great teamwork that when forensic anthropologists go to the scene that we have with our stakeholders, specifically the police and cadaver dog handlers, technicians that do the mapping for us, fire marshals. I mean, we work as part of a team with that. In my reading, and I have done quite a bit of this because of wrongful convictions due to cadaver dog, well, use of cadaver dogs. Given the time that we're dealing with, for the older graves, cadaver dogs may not be useful. With some of the newer, and it's a good question because some of the more recent graves, and I know that some of these sites, are not that old. They just went out of use not that long ago. Some of the more recent deaths, it may be useful to have a cadaver dog. And in order to do that, you would have to core into the grave a little bit, not too deep that you would hit something. But cadaver dogs could definitely be another tool that could be used. Yes.
Thank you. And I think Kona had her hand up earlier. No, I guess she's her hand is down now. So, and Rebecca, did you have anything further to add?
Yeah, certainly we use cadaver dogs in our work when it's necessary. So it's possible that we may need to enlist the support of our four-legged relatives.
Okay, thank you. And we've had many comments on the chat line of how awesome your presentations are, and how grateful they are for sharing that information. So the next question is, Inuit children who went to Chesterfield Inlet were sent from three regions: Baffin region, uh, Kelivlip, I can't pronounce that. My Blackfoot gets in the way region, and the Central Arctic. Identification in any way, identification in any way is needed in the North. So I guess they're inquiring, in those regions, whether identification is possible. So who should I start with, Kathy?
Um, are they asking if identification of the individual is possible, or not quite sure?
Not quite sure, but that's a
Okay.
possibility.
Well, certainly. I mean, Inuit, North, any community, it's the same things that I went over in my presentation apply equally.
Okay. Is there anything to add from the other panelists? Okay. Okay. Well, and certainly Anna was wondering if you do work with Sherry Hall. Uh, I believe she does work with cadaver dogs, and there's many individuals out there that do specialize in that area. So I'm assuming that that resource list is available to all of you when you're looking at having to tap into that type of resource. Is there any comments on that?
I generally work with the OPP cadaver dogs. They're very well
Yeah.
trained, and yeah, just because it's Ontario and they have a committed training program for these dogs. So, and they're very helpful on searches. So that's generally the group that I work with. And I know there are others in other areas of the province and also across Canada.
Okay. Thank you. And I think we're getting close to the end. And one question here: can anything be determined where the persons have been burned in a furnace and the remains buried? So,
I guess I'll start.
okay.
Go
So
ahead, Rebecca.
it will depend on the state of those remains. So one of the questions that we ask would be, was this person alive or dead at the time? And you can see effects of fire-related changes in the bones if it's gone deep enough. But it really kind of depends on the state of the remains if they're found and they had been burned in a furnace.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the stories, sometimes from my own family of, babies being born to young girls in these schools and being thrown in a furnace. The chances of finding remains at this point, I would assume would be pretty low. Infant bones are very, very small, they're very fragile, and they don't hold up very well in fire, let alone in the ground after a period of time. I'm sure, Kathy can speak a little bit more to that. Um, it possibly, but I wouldn't hold out too much hope for that, especially in that case.
Okay. Okay. Any more comments? Okay, and looks like we're right on time. We're close to wrapping up. I just wanted to, for Rebecca, you developed a background paper that you mentioned earlier that will be published soon on the National Advisory Committee website. Can you tell us a little more about what to expect?
Sure, there'll be two versions, a long version for people that like a lot of details, and then there's a shorter version just highlighting sort of the information in the longer version. And it just takes people through the process of how the forensic disciplines can unfold, what communities can have some idea of expecting in this work, and really just to empower people that this is their decisions of families, of communities, and we're really here just to serve.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the final, I'm just checking to see if there's maybe we might have time for one more question. Okay, so just to wrap up, I'd like to maybe ask each of uh, the panelists here, yourself, Kathy, Kona, and Rebecca, and also Monica. And we'll start with Rebecca. But what is one takeaway that you would like to highlight from this webinar?
I would really like people going away with this understanding that we are here to help you go through this process. It's very hard work, and the decisions ultimately rely with families and communities about doing any of the forensic work.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass it on to Kona.
Yeah, I want to tell people that again, yes, we're here for you. We're here to provide and share this information, all the benefit of the years of training and expertise that we've developed, and also that we're learning and we're trying to understand how we can work together on this. This is going to take a long time. This is not going to happen overnight, and uh, it's important for people to realize that we may not be able to provide all the answers that people are looking for, but we will do our best.
Okay, thank you. Kathy?
Well, thanks for leaving me something to say, Rebecca and Kona. I agree with both of what they have said. The process is all yours to determine and to decide. But as I said previously, we are totally open to any questions you have along the way. We will give you our best no matter what you decide. I hope that I've given some people some things to think about in between, not digging and removing. So they think that there may be some other options, and it's up to you to make the determination. And I wish you all luck. I know this is a very difficult decision to make, but we're here to help you. Anything you need.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy. And Monica, is there one takeaway that you'd like to highlight from the webinar? Your mic is off and your camera is off. So I'm just wondering if you're still connected there. Yeah, your mic is still off. Okay. If you can press on the bottom there for your mic on, that'd be great. Maybe I'll get the technicians to maybe help you get that on, and I'll say a few words until you're able to connect in, if that's okay. So I just want to thank, all three of you, on behalf of the National Advisory Committee. We really really appreciate the time that you've taken to share and especially the experience you have and the knowledge that you have and the expertise you have in this field, because that really helps us as we move forward and be able to reconnect with you at times when we need clarity or we need direction. That's so important. And so thank you for today. And there's many things that you shared and a lot of information. And sometimes it can be complex, other times, you know, just hearing it in that way, it helps us, give us a clarity and understanding that we need and looking at some of the steps that we need to move forward. And, of course, being a police officer in the past and working with many Indigenous communities and serious crimes is so important for that engagement, that traditional protocol being part of it. And thank you for, mentioning those throughout your presentations today. And I would also, I just want to, express thanks on behalf of everybody. So thank you for that. We're going to be wrapping up the session, and I just wanted to, bring us back to, the mental health supports that we do have. And on the chat line, we do have the number for, if I can find it now. Here we go. So we have, the number for the National Indian Resident School Crisis Line. It's 1-866-925-4419, and that's on the chat. And also, our support worker, Sandra Delaron, she's available, and she'll be available for an hour after the webinar, and her link is shown on the chat. So with that, I would like to try and get Monica on to close this event in a good way, but also express my thanks for the prayers and the strong, powerful words that you shared earlier, and also when you are on, maybe you can share one of those highlights that you got from this presentation. So I don't know, are you able to get on now? Yeah, your mic is still off. Yeah, the camera's on, I can see you, but I can't hear you at this point. Okay.
Oops.
Craig, I was wondering if you can help her get
I'm not sure from this end if I can. Monica, the technical support suggested you try refreshing your screen again, which will create a bit of a delay, and you'll have to log back. You'll have to request to speak again, but maybe we could try that.
And while we're waiting for that, 2 hours has been quite a long time for all the participants, and I just want to offer my appreciation and thanks for all of you, linking into this webinar and being part of this and taking the time out of your busy day to hear these incredible presentations. And so thank you. And I think we're almost there with Monica.
Am I on now? Can you hear me? Okay,
yeah,
great.
It's all yours now, Monica.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say that I learned a lot, more than what I learned on TV. Anyway, so I'll say the closing prayer. Sumakun hamalo mana maturatidlika kajuramitigu pakatigilautigu, and thank you for answering our prayer and giving us wisdom that are required to do this work. And I bless each and every one of the participants, and I wish them good health and a good night. Trinami. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your prayer, Monica, and your beautiful words. And I just want to thank you all again, Kathy, Kona, and Rebecca, and everybody online. Have a great day, rest of the day, and certainly enjoyed today's presentation. So have a great day.